Thomas Bennet recognized the sound immediately, the light scrape of a key missing the lock on the first attempt, followed by the distinctive click of the door opening at precisely 2:47 a.m. His wife, Claire, was home from another late night that had nothing to do with her job at the investment firm. He remained motionless in bed, eyes closed, breathing carefully regulated to mimic sleep. The routine was familiar. She would slip off her shoes in the entryway, tiptoe through the darkened living room, and spend exactly 7 minutes in the guest bathroom before finally joining him in bed, smelling of toothpaste and mouthwash rather than the wine and cologne that had likely characterized her evening. As predicted, Claire slid under the covers 14 minutes after entering the house. Thomas felt her hesitate, then place a light hand on his shoulder, checking if he was awake, pretending affection if he was. He maintained the steady rhythm of sleep. "Tom," she whispered, more performance than genuine inquiry. When he didn't respond, she turned away with a nearly inaudible sigh of relief and settled on her side of the bed. Thomas continued the charade of sleep while his mind remained painfully alert. This marked the 4th late night this month with the same pattern, the same weak excuses about client dinners running long or impromptu strategy sessions. The same lies that had been accumulating throughout their 7-year marriage like a slow-growing cancer that had finally reached critical mass. Morning arrived with Claire already gone, a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter explaining she had an early meeting. Thomas studied the familiar handwriting, noting the slight unevenness that suggested it had been written in a hurry, or perhaps with a mild hangover. The coffee maker was cold, she hadn't even paused for her usual morning ritual. Thomas poured himself a cup from the pot he prepared and sat at the kitchen island, mentally reviewing his carefully constructed plan. Today was the day. After months of meticulous preparation, detailed documentation, and strategic consultations, he was finally ready to execute the escape route he had engineered with the precision that characterized his work as a structural engineer. His phone chimed with a text from Claire. "Forgot to mention dinner with the Hamiltons tonight. Richard needs to discuss the Westview project with you. 7 p.m. at Lou Bernardine. Wear the gray suit." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that had become his constant companion over the past year as Claire's controlling behavior intensified. The message wasn't a request but a command, delivered with the assumption of compliance that characterized all their interactions now. He didn't reply. Instead, he finished his coffee and made a different call. "Margaret Sullivan's office," answered a crisp, professional voice. "This is Thomas Bennet. I'd like to confirm our appointment this afternoon." "Yes, Mr. Bennet. Miss Sullivan is expecting you at 2 o'clock. All the documents you requested have been prepared." "Thank you. Please let her know I'll be bringing the final items we discussed." The call complete, Thomas moved through the house with purpose, gathering the last pieces of evidence needed to finalize his exit strategy. From a locked drawer in his home office, he retrieved a USB drive containing meticulously organized files, financial records, text messages, emails, and photographs, all documented and dated with the systematic approach of someone accustomed to creating structural plans where every detail matters. His next stop was the master bedroom closet, where he removed a small fire safe hidden behind his winter clothes. Inside lay his personal documents, birth certificate, passport, social security card, and other irreplaceable items that Claire had organized for him years ago, effectively taking control of his essential identity markers. He had quietly obtained duplicates over the past 6 months, leaving the originals in place to avoid raising suspicions. As he worked, Thomas reflected on the gradual deterioration of their marriage, how Claire's occasional criticism had evolved into constant control, how her subtle manipulations had become overt emotional abuse, how her gaslighting had made him question his own perceptions until he began secretly recording conversations to verify his sanity. The final catalyst had come 3 months earlier during a rare direct confrontation about her late nights and obvious affair. "I think we should consider separation," he had suggested, trying to maintain composure while addressing her latest transparent lie about a work function that her own colleague had inadvertently contradicted. Claire's response had been immediate and chilling. She had laughed, actually laughed, before fixing him with a look of amused contempt. "Leave me? Oh, Tom, You won't leave. You can't. Her voice had carried absolute certainty. Your name is on the mortgage I secured through my family connections. Your job depends on relationships I've cultivated. Your entire social circle exists through me. She had stepped closer, her smile never reaching her eyes. Besides, who would believe anything negative about me? The dedicated financial advisor, community volunteer, devoted wife? No, Tom. You're staying right here where you belong. The conversation had concluded with her patting his cheek condescendingly before leaving for another client dinner, her confidence in her control over him absolute and unshakable. That night had crystallized what Thomas had already begun to accept: direct confrontation within the relationship was futile. Claire's network of influence, carefully cultivated image, and masterful manipulation would always give her the upper hand in any conventional separation approach. He needed to be strategic, thorough, and completely covert in his preparations. The following day, he had sought out Margaret Sullivan, a divorce attorney known for handling complex, high-conflict cases with particular expertise in situations involving controlling partners. Their initial consultation had stretched to 3 hours as Thomas detailed the progression of Claire's behavior and his concerns about her potential reactions. She'll be vicious, he had explained. She won't accept any scenario where she isn't in complete control. Margaret had nodded understanding. Then we need to be exceptionally prepared before making any moves. This isn't just about filing paperwork, it's about constructing a comprehensive exit strategy that addresses financial entanglements, potential reputation damage, and your personal safety. Over the subsequent months, Thomas had followed Margaret's guidance with military precision, documenting incidents, securing financial resources, establishing independent accounts, gathering evidence of Claire's infidelity and financial manipulation, and quietly consulting with his employer's legal team to insulate his professional position from potential fallout. Now, 3 months later, all preparations were complete. The trap Claire had constructed, financial dependency, professional vulnerability, isolation from independent support systems, had been systematically dismantled without her knowledge. Today, the foundation she believed unshakable would crumble beneath her. At precisely 1:45 p.m., Thomas left their suburban home for his appointment with Margaret, the final phase of their carefully orchestrated plan about to commence. He drove deliberately, maintaining exactly the speed limit, hyper-aware that even a minor traffic violation could complicate the day's critical timing. Margaret's office projected quiet competence, tasteful furnishings, subdued colors, and an atmosphere of calm authority. She greeted Thomas with a firm handshake, her expression conveying professional determination rather than personal sympathy. Everything is prepared, she confirmed as they settled in her office. The filing is complete, and service will occur precisely as we discussed. Are you certain about the timing? Thomas nodded. Claire has a standing 3 o'clock meeting with her team every Thursday. It's the one professional commitment she never misses because it's led by her direct supervisor. Having this delivered during that meeting ensures maximum impact while preventing her from immediately leaving to confront me. Margaret studied him carefully. And you're staying at the secured location we discussed? With no possessions that could identify it? Yes. Everything's arranged exactly as planned. Good. Margaret opened a folder containing multiple documents. Let's review everything one final time. These are copies of all the filings: divorce petition citing irreconcilable differences, documentation of financial impropriety, evidence of infidelity, application for temporary restraining order based on emotional abuse and threatening behavior, emergency motion for exclusive use of your separate property, and notification of the freeze on joint accounts. Thomas reviewed each document carefully, noting how the formal legal language transformed his personal nightmare into objective facts and requests for specific remedies. There was something vindicating about seeing Claire's behavior documented in official filings, her manipulation patterns described in clear, unemotional terms that would be difficult to dismiss or reinterpret. The temporary restraining order is particularly important, Margaret emphasized. Based on the documented threats and controlling behavior, we have grounds for immediate protection. This prevents her from contacting you directly, coming to your location, or using third parties to communicate except through legal counsel. She'll be furious, Thomas noted, not with fear but as a factual observation. Undoubtedly, Margaret agreed. Which is precisely why these protections are necessary. Her history suggests she'll attempt to reassert control through direct confrontation, manipulation of shared social connections, or financial pressure. We've addressed each of those vectors. The meeting continued with final confirmations of logistics, Thomas's secure temporary residence, communication protocols, security measures, and contingency plans for various potential responses from Claire. Nothing was left to chance, every scenario had been anticipated and prepared for. As they concluded, Margaret fixed Thomas with a direct gaze. Once service occurs, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? More certain than I've been about anything in years, Thomas replied without hesitation. Claire has spent our entire marriage convincing me I have no options, no power, and no way out. Today she learns how thoroughly wrong she's been. Margaret nodded, satisfied with his resolve. Then it's time. The process server is already positioned. At exactly 3 o'clock, Claire will be served with the complete package of filings in front of her colleagues. By 3:15, her access to your joint accounts will be restricted to monitored withdrawals for basic necessities. By 3:30, the security team will be in place at your home to document her behavior and ensure she doesn't remove or damage property covered in the filings. Thomas checked his watch, 2:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours since Claire had slipped home from her latest infidelity. The symmetry felt appropriate somehow. What now? He asked. Now you proceed to your secure location and maintain complete communication blackout except through the encrypted channel we've established. My team will monitor all developments and keep you updated on a need-to-know basis. Margaret closed the folder decisively. Claire believed she had constructed the perfect trap. Today she discovers that what she actually built was a house of cards. As Thomas drove to the small, furnished apartment he had secretly leased under an LLC 3 months earlier, he experienced an unexpected sense of lightness. For years, Claire's psychological manipulation had created an ever-present weight on his consciousness, second-guessing his perceptions, censoring his speech, adjusting his behavior to minimize her criticism and control. That burden was lifting with each mile that separated him from their shared home. The apartment was deliberately impersonal, functional furniture, basic necessities, nothing that reflected his tastes or interests that Claire might recognize if she somehow discovered the location. He had selected it specifically for its advanced security features, restricted access building, no-name directory listing, 24-hour surveillance, and a management company with strict privacy policies. At precisely 3 p.m., Thomas powered off his regular phone, removing the battery as an extra precaution. He then activated the new secure phone Margaret had provided, a device Claire had no knowledge of, with a number known only to his attorney and the security team. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The first update came at 3:27 p.m. via encrypted text. Package delivered. Subject initially confused, then visibly distressed upon reviewing contents. Attempted to leave meeting but was detained by supervisor regarding professional obligations. Currently still in conference room with documentation. Security team in position at residence. Thomas absorbed this information without immediate response. He could imagine the scene perfectly, Claire's initial bewilderment as unfamiliar legal documents interrupted her meeting, followed by dawning comprehension as she registered their significance. Her instinct would be to locate and confront him immediately, to reassert control through the direct intimidation that had always worked before. But this time, Thomas wasn't there. This time, her only channel of communication was through professional legal representatives who were immune to her emotional manipulation tactics. This time, the carefully constructed narrative she had created, devoted wife, successful professional, respected community member, was contradicted by methodically documented evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and emotional abuse. For the first time in their marriage, Claire would have to respond to reality rather than the carefully curated version of it she preferred. The second update arrived at 4:15 p.m. Subject returned to residence, visibly agitated. Attempted to make multiple calls, presumably to you, which went unanswered. Security team maintaining perimeter surveillance. Subject observed throwing items in master bedroom. Thomas felt a strange detachment reading this clinical description of what was undoubtedly a significant emotional outburst. The Claire he knew would be beyond furious, she would be experiencing the complete disintegration of her sense of control. Her perfectly manipulated world was collapsing, and for once, her practiced charm and strategic tears wouldn't fix the situation. At 5:03 p.m., the encrypted channel delivered another message. Subject attempting to access joint accounts online. Multiple failed attempts observed through financial monitoring system. This update confirmed that Claire had discovered the account restrictions, another pillar of her control strategy crumbling. Throughout their marriage, she had maintained primary oversight of their finances despite Thomas's substantially higher income as a senior structural engineer. She had positioned this arrangement as playing to their strengths, but in reality, it had created another vector of dependency and control. With Margaret's guidance, Thomas had spent months meticulously documenting their financial history, identifying Claire's patterns of moving funds between accounts, her concealment of personal expenses as household necessities, and her systematic underreporting of her own substantial income to maintain the narrative that Thomas needed her financial management. Those documented patterns now justified the temporary freeze on joint accounts pending court review, a standard protective measure given evidence of potential financial misconduct, but one that effectively severed Claire's access to the resources she had long weaponized. At 7:32 p.m., a more detailed update arrived. Subject has contacted attorney James Wilson of Parker & Wilson. Wilson attempted to contact our office but was directed to after-hours protocols. Formal communication expected tomorrow morning. Subject continues to attempt contact through various numbers and social media channels. All monitoring systems functioning as intended. Security reports subject's sister arrived at residence at 7:15 p.m. The involvement of Claire's sister, Elaine, was expected. Claire had carefully cultivated a support network of family members and friends who knew only her curated version of their marriage, people who would reflexively take her side in any conflict based on years of selective information sharing. Thomas had prepared for this aspect as well, compiling documentation of how Claire had systematically isolated him from his own support networks while building a chorus of defenders who knew nothing of her private behavior. Margaret had included this pattern in the filings as evidence of the controlling dynamics that justified the temporary restraining order. The final update of the evening came at 11:46 p.m. Security confirms subject and sister remain at residence. Multiple individuals observed arriving/departing throughout evening. Subject made attempt to access your personal email and cloud storage accounts at approximately 10:30 p.m. All security protocols held. Recommend maintaining complete communication blackout through minimum 48-hour initial response period. Thomas acknowledged the recommendation and prepared for bed in the sparse apartment. The day that had permanently altered the trajectory of his life was ending, the carefully designed plan executed flawlessly thus far. Claire had awakened that morning absolute in her conviction that Thomas was permanently trapped in her carefully constructed system of control. She would go to sleep tonight facing the irrefutable evidence that her assessment had been catastrophically wrong. As he settled into an unfamiliar bed in an impersonal room that contained nothing of his past life, Thomas experienced not anxiety but a profound sense of reclaimed agency. For years, Claire had systematically eroded his confidence, independence, and self-trust. She had convinced him, and their entire social circle, that he was indecisive, emotionally unstable, and fundamentally dependent on her superior judgment and management. Today he had proven otherwise, not through direct confrontation where her manipulation skills would give her advantage, but through methodical preparation, strategic implementation, and the unassailable voice of legal documentation. Claire had said he would never leave her. She had been so confident in her assessment that she had actually laughed at the suggestion. But Thomas wasn't laughing now. He had simply let his lawyer do the talking, and the carefully constructed documentation spoke volumes that Claire could neither dismiss nor manipulate. As sleep approached, Thomas reflected on Claire's parting words from that morning's hastily written note: "Don't forget dinner with the Hamiltons. Wear the gray suit." The gray suit now hung in a secure storage facility along with other selected possessions, waiting for the next phase of his carefully constructed exit. The dinner with the Hamiltons, like so many aspects of the life Claire had orchestrated, would proceed without him. And for the first time in years, that thought brought peace rather than anxiety. Thomas awoke at his usual time, 5:30 a.m., momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where he was and why. The spare apartment felt both strange and liberating, its impersonal furnishings representing freedom from the meticulously curated home where every object had been selected or approved by Claire. He followed a deliberately modified morning routine, avoiding the habitual patterns Claire might anticipate if she somehow discovered his location. Instead of his usual run, he used the building's small fitness room. Instead of coffee from the specialty roaster Claire insisted upon, he made a simple cup from grocery store grounds. Each small deviation represented another step toward reclaiming independent choices. At 7:15 a.m., the secure phone vibrated with an update. Subject remained at residence overnight with sister. Multiple calls placed to your employer, family members, and mutual contacts between 7 to 9 p.m. yesterday. Security team maintains position. Attorney Wilson has formally requested conference with Sullivan for 10 a.m. Thomas acknowledged the update, unsurprised by Claire's attempts to locate him through their social and professional connections. This pattern had been anticipated in their strategic planning. Claire would initially attempt direct contact, then escalate to mutual connections when that failed, presenting herself as the concerned spouse while painting Thomas as unstable or unreasonable. Margaret had prepared for this by briefing Thomas's employer's legal department confidentially weeks earlier. His direct supervisor and HR representative had been informed that Thomas was addressing a personal legal matter that might involve contact from his spouse, with instructions to direct all communication to his attorney. Similar briefings had been provided to Thomas's family members, with appropriate documentation to help them understand the situation without exposing excessive private details. The second update arrived as Thomas was preparing a simple breakfast. Subject observed leaving residence at 6:45 a.m. with overnight bag. Security confirms destination as sister's apartment. Subject's attorney has submitted urgent motion for hearing regarding temporary orders, claiming severe financial hardship and deliberate misrepresentation in initial filings. This development aligned with Margaret's predictions. Claire would attempt to regain control through emergency legal maneuvers, presenting herself as the victim while seeking to overturn the protective measures Thomas had secured. At 9:30 a.m., Margaret initiated contact through the encrypted channel. Preparing for conference with opposing counsel. Based on filing language, expect aggressive stance challenging RO and financial restrictions. Have comprehensive documentation ready to counter anticipated claims. Will update after meeting. Maintain protocol. Thomas spent the morning reviewing work projects remotely, grateful that his profession allowed temporary telecommuting. The structural engineering firm where he'd worked for 9 years had been understanding about his need for flexible arrangements during this period, particularly after their legal team had reviewed the documented pattern of controlling behavior he'd experienced. At 11:47 a.m., the update from Margaret arrived. Conference completed. Wilson initially combative, presenting subject as blindsided victim of vindictive action. Tone shifted significantly when presented with financial documentation, text evidence, and witness statements. Now requesting reasonable accommodation for subject's legitimate financial needs pending full hearing. Have maintained all protective provisions with minor concession allowing monitored access to joint account for documented household expenses only. Full hearing scheduled for 10 days. Subject required to maintain minimum 500-foot distance until then. The message confirmed what Thomas had hoped. Claire's attempt to quickly dismantle his protective measures through legal maneuvering had failed when confronted with substantial evidence. Her attorney, likely initially convinced by Claire's persuasive victim narrative, had been forced to retreat to more modest requests upon seeing the documented reality. Thomas responded with a brief acknowledgement, then returned to his work. The remote arrangements allowed him to maintain professional productivity while navigating this personal crisis, another aspect of his preparation that Claire had likely never considered. Throughout their marriage, she had characterized his career as dependent on connections she facilitated, diminishing his professional standing and expertise. In reality, his reputation within the engineering community was solid and independent, built on technical excellence rather than social networking. At 2:15 p.m., another update arrived. Subject observed attempting to access home office computer. Remote monitoring indicates multiple password attempts on your personal accounts. All security protocols functioning as designed. Subject appeared distressed when sister attempted intervention. Financial monitoring shows subject attempting to open new credit accounts in joint name, all automatically flagged and declined per court order. Thomas had anticipated this phase as well, Claire's increasing frustration as she discovered the systematic dismantling of her control mechanisms. Each failed attempt to access accounts, each declined application, each blocked avenue of communication would further challenge her fundamental assumption that Thomas remained manipulable and dependent. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. Subject's mother observed arriving at sister's residence at 3:40 p.m. Subject, sister, and mother departed together at 4:05 p.m. Security team monitoring. Destination appears to be subject's parents' residence. The involvement of Claire's mother represented an escalation Thomas had considered possible but not certain. Evelyn Parker was a formidable woman who had served as both role model and enabler for Claire's controlling tendencies. Throughout their marriage, she had subtly reinforced the narrative that Thomas was fortunate to have Claire managing their lives, often making comments about how lost he would be without her daughter's guidance. Margaret's response arrived minutes later. Family consolidation expected. Prepare for potential pressure through extended family channels. All family members on contact restriction list have been formally notified of legal requirements. Any violation will be documented for court presentation. The evening passed quietly, with only brief updates confirming Claire remained at her parents' home. Thomas used the time to continue organizing documentation and preparing for the upcoming hearing. The temporary reprieve from Claire's constant presence allowed for reflection unmarred by her immediate influence, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. As he reviewed text messages, emails, and financial records that would help establish the pattern of control in court, Thomas was struck by how normalized the manipulation had become. Individual incidents that had seemed manageable in isolation formed a disturbing pattern when viewed collectively, a systematic campaign to undermine his confidence, independence, and self-trust. At 9:37 p.m., the secure phone delivered an unexpected update. Subject has posted on social media platforms regarding sudden abandonment and cruel financial tactics. Post describes subject as blindsided and concerned for husband's mental state. Multiple mutual contacts responding with support. Documenting all public statements for court record. This development, while not explicitly planned for, was consistent with Claire's pattern of image management. She was attempting to establish a public narrative that positioned her as the concerned, loving spouse and Thomas as unstable or unreasonable. The social media posts would serve the dual purpose of rallying support while potentially drawing Thomas into direct contact to defend himself. Margaret's guidance on this had been clear: any public response would only feed the narrative and create engagement that could potentially violate the communication restrictions. The strategic approach was to document but not engage, allowing Claire's public statements to potentially contradict her private actions, contradictions that could be presented in court. The following morning brought confirmation of another anticipated development. Subject's attorney has requested full financial disclosure hearing on expedited basis, claiming deliberate concealment of assets and financial abandonment. Court date set for 5 days from now. Formal discovery requests delivered to our office at 8:15 a.m. Scope exceeds standard procedure for temporary orders. Margaret's assessment followed immediately. Aggressive discovery appears designed to identify your location and financial resources. Standard phishing expedition tactics. Our response will provide legally required financial disclosures while maintaining security protocols. Prepare for detailed financial review session at my office tomorrow, 2 p.m. The accelerated timeline suggested Claire was feeling the pressure of restricted financial access more acutely than anticipated. Throughout their marriage, she had maintained tight control over their substantial combined income, allocating Thomas a modest personal spending allowance despite his significantly higher earnings. The court-ordered restrictions had effectively reversed this dynamic, limiting her access while securing his independent resources. At midday, an update from the security team added new context. Subject observed meeting with unknown male at parent's residence. Visitor identified as Brian Taylor, loan officer at First Capital Bank. Meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. Subject appeared agitated following departure. Thomas recognized the name immediately. Brian Taylor was Claire's personal banker who had facilitated multiple financial arrangements throughout their marriage. His presence suggested Claire was seeking alternative funding sources now that the joint accounts were monitored. The apparent failure of this effort, indicated by her agitated state following the meeting, confirmed that the financial containment strategies were working as intended. The afternoon brought a more personal development. Your brother Michael attempted contact with subject at sister's apartment. Security observed brief conversation before subject's sister asked him to leave. Michael adhered to legal restrictions regarding sharing your location or circumstances, but expressed personal concerns about situation. Thomas had anticipated his family might attempt independent contact despite his briefings about the legal restrictions. Michael, his younger brother, had always been somewhat skeptical of Claire's carefully cultivated image, noticing inconsistencies that others missed. His attempt to gather first-hand information was characteristic of his protective instincts, though potentially complicated for the legal strategy. That evening, Thomas used the secure channel to request a brief, controlled call with Michael, which Margaret approved with specific parameters. The conversation was brief but revealing. She's spinning quite a story, Tom, Michael reported after initial greetings. According to Claire, you've had some kind of breakdown, emptied accounts, and disappeared without explanation. She's got her whole family mobilized along with half your social circle, all supposedly concerned about your well-being while simultaneously painting you as dangerously unstable. Did she mention the legal filings? Thomas asked. Only to dismiss them as obviously the product of paranoid thinking that she's deeply concerned about. She's playing the worried, devoted wife to perfection. Michael's tone conveyed his skepticism. I didn't challenge her directly since you asked us not to engage, but it was a performance worthy of an Oscar. And people are believing it? Some are. The ones who only know the public version of Claire. Others seem uncertain. A few have reached out to me privately with questions that suggest they've seen glimpses of the real dynamic between you two. The conversation confirmed Thomas's expectations about Claire's immediate response strategy, controlling the narrative through her established network while presenting herself as the concerned spouse rather than the controlling partner facing legal consequences. The next morning brought a significant development. Subject attempted to access safety deposit box at First National Bank at 9:15 a.m. Access denied per court order. Subject became visibly agitated, requiring bank manager intervention. Police briefly responded but no report filed. Subject departed with parents. Security monitoring maintained. The safety deposit box contained valuables and documents that Claire had insisted on controlling throughout their marriage, another manifestation of her systematic approach to maintaining power imbalances. The court order securing these assets pending formal division had effectively blocked yet another avenue she would have typically used to gain leverage. The financial disclosure meeting with Margaret proceeded as scheduled that afternoon, a meticulous review of all accounts, assets, investments, and properties that would be subject to examination at the upcoming hearing. Thomas had prepared extensively for this aspect of the process, organizing documentation that demonstrated both the legitimate sources of all assets and Claire's pattern of financial control throughout the marriage. Their strategy appears to be two-pronged, Margaret explained as they reviewed the materials. First, they're seeking to identify any resources not covered by the existing orders, hoping to find reserves you might have established. Second, they're attempting to position Claire as financially vulnerable despite her six-figure income and substantial separate assets. She's always maintained the narrative that she handles our finances because I'm incapable, Thomas noted. The reality that I've been the primary earner while she controlled the resources contradicts the image she's created. Exactly, Margaret agreed. And that contradiction will be central to our presentation. The financial documentation clearly shows a pattern of control rather than support, restricting your access while maintaining the appearance of management to others. The meeting concluded with final preparations for the upcoming hearing, including anticipated questions and strategic responses. Margaret's confidence was evident but measured. Claire is undoubtedly a persuasive presenter, she acknowledged. Her professional success depends on that skill. We should expect a compelling performance that aligns with the narrative she's already establishing publicly. Our advantage lies in documented facts rather than emotional appeals. The following day brought confirmation that Claire was indeed preparing extensively for the hearing. Subject observed meeting with Attorney Wilson for approximately 4 hours. Multiple documents exchanged. Subject later met with 3 individuals identified as colleagues from her firm. Security maintains monitoring of all locations. Later that evening, an unexpected update arrived. Subject sent email to your work account at 7:32 p.m. Content flagged by monitoring system. Message appears personal rather than professional. Full text preserved for record. No response recommended per protocol. Though curious about the content, Thomas maintained discipline, not requesting details that might potentially influence his emotional state before the hearing. The monitoring systems would preserve the communication as evidence while protecting him from direct manipulation attempts. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, a concerning development emerged. Subject observed meeting with Jack Hamilton, identified as mutual professional contact, at parents' residence at 11:15 a.m. Meeting lasted approximately 1 hour. Hamilton subsequently attempted contact with your employer's HR department at 2:20 p.m. Contact redirected to legal department per established protocol. Jack Hamilton was a senior partner at a client firm that worked with both Thomas's engineering company and Claire's investment group, a carefully cultivated connection that Claire had often leveraged in their professional lives. His attempt to contact Thomas's employer suggested Claire was escalating to professional channels in her efforts to re-establish contact and control. Margaret's assessment was prompt and decisive. Professional channel attempt documented. Legal has confirmed appropriate boundaries maintained. Appears to be testing multiple potential access points. Maintain complete protocol adherence. Any response creates opportunity for narrative manipulation. The day before the hearing brought increased activity. Multiple contact attempts through various channels observed in past 12 hours. Subject appears to be systematically working through social and professional connections. All security protocols holding. Subject observed an extended meeting with legal team. Financial monitoring indicates attempt to access home equity line of credit declined per court order. This flurry of activity confirmed Claire's growing frustration as each attempted avenue of control or contact failed. The woman who had confidently asserted Thomas would never leave her was now discovering the systematic dismantling of every mechanism she had used to maintain that control. The morning of the hearing arrived with a final preparation session at Margaret's office. As they reviewed documentation and strategy one last time, Margaret offered an observation. In my experience, this is the point where controlling partners typically make their most aggressive moves. The imminent prospect of public legal proceedings often triggers escalation when other approaches have failed. What form might that take? Thomas asked. It varies. Sometimes dramatic public accusations. Sometimes sudden claims of reconciliation desires. Sometimes previously undisclosed evidence of misconduct. The common thread is a desperate attempt to regain narrative control before independent legal evaluation occurs. With this warning in mind, Thomas proceeded to the courthouse, entering through a secure access point to avoid potential confrontation before the hearing. The courtroom was modestly populated, primarily legal representatives and a few family members, including Claire's parents and sister in the front row. Thomas deliberately avoided looking directly at Claire when she entered with her attorney, maintaining focus on Margaret and the documentation before them. In his peripheral vision, he could see Claire was immaculately dressed in conservative attire that projected professional competence with subtle vulnerability, an image carefully crafted for the proceedings. The judge, a seasoned woman in her 60s named Judge Helen Bradshaw, called the hearing to order promptly, establishing clear expectations for the proceedings. "This is a hearing regarding temporary orders in the matter of Bennett v. Bennett," she began. "I've reviewed the initial filings, responsive motions, and supporting documentation from both parties. Today's proceedings will address the appropriateness of the temporary restraining order, financial restrictions, and property control orders currently in place. We will not be addressing final distribution or permanent arrangements at this time." Claire's attorney, James Wilson, presented first, portraying Claire as the blindsided victim of extreme and unwarranted legal action. "Your Honor, my client was served these extensive legal documents without warning or prior indication of marital dissatisfaction," Wilson argued. "She has been cut off from financial resources, banned from her own home, and prevented from communicating with her husband of 7 years under the guise of a restraining order based on vague claims of controlling behavior." Wilson continued, presenting Claire as the dedicated spouse who had managed their household and finances as a mutual arrangement rather than a control mechanism. "Mrs. Bennett has been the financial steward of this marriage by mutual agreement, using her professional expertise to manage their considerable joint resources. Mr. Bennett's sudden seizure of these accounts has created significant hardship and appears designed to create leverage rather than address legitimate concerns." Throughout this presentation, Thomas maintained a neutral expression, avoiding both defensive reactions and visible responses that could be interpreted as dismissive or hostile. Margaret had emphasized the importance of composed demeanor throughout the proceedings, regardless of what claims might be presented. When it was Margaret's turn to respond, she approached the podium with calm confidence. "Your Honor, what opposing counsel has characterized as sudden action without warning was in fact the culmination of years of documented controlling behavior, financial manipulation, and psychological abuse," she began. "The temporary orders currently in place were granted based on substantial evidence that met the legal threshold for emergency protection." She methodically addressed each claim Wilson had presented, contrasting the narrative with documented evidence. Regarding financial management, the records clearly show a pattern not of mutual stewardship but of systematic control despite Mr. Bennett providing approximately 70% of household income. These bank statements demonstrate Mrs. Bennett maintained restrictive access to funds while requiring detailed accounting of Mr. Bennett's minimal allowance from his own earnings. Margaret continued through each aspect of the temporary orders, presenting documentation that supported their necessity, text messages showing controlling language, financial records demonstrating manipulation, witness statements describing observed behavior patterns, and documentation of Claire's ongoing affair that contradicted her presentation as the devoted spouse. As Margaret presented this evidence, Thomas noticed Claire leaning urgently toward her attorney, whispering with increasing agitation as each new document was introduced. Wilson appeared increasingly uncomfortable, his initial confident posture giving way to the demeanor of someone recognizing their client had provided incomplete information. The judge's questions were incisive and specific, focusing on the documentation rather than emotional claims from either side. When Wilson attempted to characterize certain behaviors as mutual household management decisions, Judge Bradshaw directed him to address the specific evidence presented rather than general characterizations. "Counselor, I'm looking at documented financial transactions and communications that appear inconsistent with your characterization," she noted at one point. "I need you to address these specific exhibits rather than general statements about the nature of their relationship." The pivotal moment came when Margaret introduced the audio recordings Thomas had carefully collected over the previous months, conversations where Claire explicitly stated Thomas couldn't leave because she controlled their finances, professional connections, and social relationships. As Claire's own voice filled the courtroom stating, "Leave me? Oh, Tom. You won't leave. You can't." Thomas observed her physical reaction. She seemed to physically shrink in her chair, the confident posture collapsing as her own words contradicted everything her attorney had presented about their relationship dynamic. Judge Bradshaw listened to the recordings without visible reaction, though she made extensive notes throughout. When the presentation of evidence concluded, she addressed both parties directly. Based on the evidence presented, I am maintaining all temporary orders as originally issued, with minor modifications to allow for documented household expense access as previously arranged between counsel. Her tone was firm and matter-of-fact. The documentation presented meets the threshold for continuing these protective measures pending full dissolution proceedings. She looked directly at Claire for the first time. Mrs. Bennet, the evidence suggests a pattern of behavior inconsistent with your attorney's characterizations. I strongly advise compliance with all aspects of these orders while dissolution proceeds. Turning to Thomas, she added, Mr. Bennet, while the court recognizes your right to protection from controlling behavior, I expect continued transparency regarding all financial matters and proper maintenance of joint property pending final distribution. With that, she concluded the hearing, setting dates for subsequent proceedings and discovery deadlines. As the courtroom began to clear, Thomas maintained his focus forward, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Claire or her family members as Margaret efficiently gathered their materials. They exited through the same secure access point, Margaret offering her assessment once they reached her car. That went as well as we could have hoped, she observed. Judge Bradshaw is known for focusing on documentation rather than emotional appeals, which worked in our favor given the extensive evidence we presented. What happens now? Thomas asked, experiencing a complex mixture of vindication and lingering anxiety. Claire has few options at this point, Margaret explained. The financial restrictions remain in place. The restraining order remains in effect. Her attorney will likely advise a more realistic approach to settlement negotiations given the strength of our evidence and the judge's clear perspective on the situation. Thomas nodded, processing this information as they drove away from the courthouse. The woman who had laughed at the idea he might leave her had just watched a judge validate everything he had documented about her controlling behavior. The carefully cultivated image she had presented to their social circle, devoted wife, financial expert, supportive partner, had been systematically dismantled by her own documented actions and recorded words. She had said he would never leave her. Today, through his lawyer's methodical presentation of irrefutable evidence, he had proven how profoundly wrong she had been. The days following the hearing brought a noticeable shift in Claire's approach. Where she had initially responded with aggressive attempts to regain control through multiple channels, she now retreated into strategic silence. The flurry of social media posts stopped abruptly. The attempts to contact Thomas through mutual connections ceased. Even the communication from her attorney took on a more measured, procedural tone. This is actually the more concerning phase, Margaret explained during their weekly update meeting. When controlling personalities realize direct confrontation isn't working, they often shift to more subtle, calculated approaches. What might that look like? Thomas asked, still adjusting to the unfamiliar quiet after weeks of constant updates about Claire's activities. It varies, but common tactics include appearing to accept the situation while quietly building alternative narratives, seeking sympathy through carefully crafted vulnerability, or attempting to present themselves as the reasonable party seeking reconciliation, Margaret explained. It's essentially a shift from frontal assault to flanking maneuvers. This assessment proved accurate when, 3 days after the hearing, Thomas received a formal communication through legal channels. Our client wishes to express willingness to engage in mediation regarding equitable dissolution arrangements, provided certain immediate concerns are addressed. Specifically, Mrs. Bennet requests reconsideration of the complete exclusion from the marital home, suggesting a scheduled access arrangement to retrieve personal items and assess maintenance needs of the property. Margaret's response was measured but firm. While our client appreciates the shift toward constructive dialogue, the current protective orders remain necessary given documented patterns of behavior. We propose a one-time supervised access to the residence with specific parameters regarding timing, duration, and items to be removed, conducted with appropriate third-party presence to ensure compliance with court directives. This exchange initiated a carefully orchestrated process, each communication formally documented, each proposed interaction structured with clear boundaries and independent oversight. Claire's attorney accepted the supervised access proposal with minor modifications, suggesting a tone of reasonable cooperation that contrasted sharply with earlier aggressive positions. The scheduled access to the marital home was arranged for the following Tuesday morning. Thomas would not be present, but the security team would maintain discreet monitoring while a representative from Margaret's office supervised the visit directly, ensuring Claire removed only agreed-upon personal items while documenting the property's condition. "Is this a genuine shift in approach or another tactical move?" Thomas asked during his preparation briefing with Margaret. "Likely both," she assessed. The court hearing demonstrated that her initial strategy wasn't effective. The evidence was too substantial, the judge too perceptive. Shifting to apparent cooperation serves dual purposes. It presents a more favorable image for future proceedings while potentially creating opportunities to gather information or access she's been denied. The supervised visit proceeded without significant incident. Claire arrived with her sister, maintained professional composure throughout, and adhered to the agreed-upon parameters regarding what items could be removed. The only notable moment came when she paused in Thomas's home office, studying the space with an expression the supervising representative described as calculating before commenting that some important financial documents appear to be missing. "A fishing expedition," Margaret noted when reviewing the visit report. "She was hoping to determine what documentation you might have secured before filing." The comment was for the record rather than practical recovery. 2 days after the visit, a more personal communication arrived through formal channels, a handwritten letter from Claire that her attorney had submitted to Margaret with a note indicating it contained personal reflections that his client wished to convey in the interest of potential reconciliation exploration. Margaret forwarded the letter with a clear advisory, "Review at your discretion." Note that while presented as personal communication, anything submitted through legal channels becomes part of the formal record. Consider this when determining whether or how to respond. Thomas stared at the scanned image of Claire's distinctive handwriting for several minutes before deciding to read it. "Tom. After much reflection, I feel compelled to reach out directly, heart to heart rather than through the cold distance of legal proceedings. These past weeks have been devastating, not just because of the practical disruptions to our life together, but because of the profound disconnect they reveal in how we each experienced our marriage. Where I saw partnership and mutual support, you apparently felt control and manipulation. This fundamental difference in perception is both painful and confusing. I won't pretend to fully understand how we reached this point of such complete misalignment, but I am willing to listen and learn. Perhaps in the intensity of building our life together, certain patterns developed that felt supportive to me but constraining to you. If that's the case, I'm truly sorry. 7 years of shared life shouldn't end without at least attempting genuine dialogue about these perceptions. Whatever issues exist between us, surely they deserve direct conversation rather than communication filtered exclusively through attorneys who have professional incentives to maintain conflict rather than facilitate understanding. I'm not asking you to dismiss the legal proceedings if you're certain that's what you want. I'm simply suggesting that parallel to those formal processes, we might establish a channel for direct, honest conversation about what brought us to this point and whether there's any path forward that we've not yet considered. Whatever you decide, please know that despite the current circumstances, the years we shared meant everything to me. Claire. Thomas read the letter twice, recognizing the familiar patterns beneath its seemingly heartfelt language. The subtle positioning of their marriage problems as differences in perception rather than documented behaviors. The implication that attorneys were unnecessarily prolonging conflict for professional gain. The strategic placement of the phrase "meant everything to me" in past tense, suggesting both emotional investment and acceptance of loss. Most tellingly, the letter contained no acknowledgement of the specific behaviors documented in court, the financial control, the infidelity, the recorded statements explicitly threatening Thomas with professional and social isolation if he attempted to leave. Instead, it reframed the situation as mutual misunderstanding rather than deliberate manipulation. After careful consideration, Thomas drafted a response for Margaret's review. Margaret. I've reviewed Claire's letter and recognize the approach being employed. Rather than acknowledging documented behaviors, she's attempting to reframe our situation as a mutual misunderstanding that requires direct communication to resolve. I see no benefit to establishing direct communication channels outside the legal framework we've established. The patterns that necessitated formal protection haven't been addressed in any meaningful way, merely repackaged in conciliatory language. Please convey to opposing counsel that while I acknowledge receipt of the communication, I prefer to maintain the current structured approach to all interactions pending resolution of the dissolution proceedings. Thomas. Margaret approved this response with a single modification, the addition of a sentence indicating Thomas remained committed to efficient and equitable resolution of all matters through established legal processes. The measured, unemotional tone maintained the strategic approach that had proven effective thus far. Claire's next move came through professional channels rather than personal ones. 3 days after Thomas's response was delivered, he received an unexpected call from Howard Daniels, the CEO of the engineering firm where he worked. "Thomas, do you have a few minutes? Something's come up that I'd like to discuss directly." The conversation that followed confirmed Margaret's predictions about Claire's evolving tactics. Howard explained that Claire had reached out to him directly, expressing concerns about Thomas's well-being and suggesting that recent legal actions may be affecting his professional judgment. She had framed her contact as the worried spouse seeking support for her husband rather than attempting to undermine his position. She was quite compelling, Howard admitted. Very concerned, very measured in her presentation. Said she was reaching out reluctantly but felt professional colleagues should be aware of potential instability. "And how did you respond?" Thomas asked, maintaining calm despite the clear attempt to damage his professional standing. "I told her that all communications regarding employees should go through HR and legal channels, then contacted our general counsel immediately," Howard replied. "They confirmed they'd been briefed about your situation previously and advised me of the court orders in place. I'm calling now because I wanted you to hear about this directly from me rather than through legal channels." Thomas thanked Howard for his transparency and professionalism, relieved that the preemptive briefing with key stakeholders had effectively neutralized Claire's attempt to create professional doubt about him. The incident confirmed Margaret's assessment. Having failed with direct confrontation, Claire was now attempting more subtle approaches to regain some measure of control or create pressure that might force direct contact. When informed about this development, Margaret added it to their growing documentation of Claire's behavior patterns. This demonstrates continued attempts to exert control through professional channels despite court orders specifically prohibiting such interference. It will be relevant in final settlement discussions and any contested proceedings. The following weeks established a pattern, Claire maintaining apparent cooperation through formal legal processes while periodically attempting indirect approaches through various channels. Each attempt was documented, addressed through appropriate protocols, and added to the growing body of evidence demonstrating her continued efforts to circumvent the established boundaries. Financial discovery proceeded methodically, revealing additional accounts Claire had not initially disclosed, investment vehicles she had established using joint funds but registered under her family's trust structures to obscure ownership. These discoveries strengthened Thomas's position in settlement negotiations, demonstrating patterns of financial concealment that contradicted her initial representations to the court. 2 months after the initial hearing, Margaret arranged a meeting to discuss a significant development. "Claire's team has proposed a settlement framework," she explained, presenting a detailed document. While positioned as a generous offer to expedite resolution, it actually represents a significant shift from their initial position. They're essentially conceding on most major points while seeking to maintain a narrative of magnanimity. Thomas reviewed the proposal carefully. It included equitable division of disclosed assets, maintenance of the restraining order provisions as mutual agreement to respectful distance, and structured division of the marital home proceeds once sold. The language carefully avoided any admission of wrongdoing while effectively accepting the structural reality that Claire's position had been fundamentally weakened by documented evidence. "What's your assessment?" Thomas asked. with some modifications to address the recently discovered financial vehicles and stronger language regarding non-disparagement provisions. This provides a reasonable framework for resolution, Margaret replied. They're recognizing that continued litigation presents significant risks given the documentation we've compiled. And the timing? It seems abrupt after weeks of peripheral maneuvering. Two factors likely contributed, Margaret explained. First, their financial discovery has confirmed you've been transparent about assets, undermining any narrative about hidden resources. Second, our latest filing included documentation of Claire's attempt to contact your employer despite court orders expressly prohibiting such actions. After detailed discussion of specific provisions, Thomas authorized Margaret to proceed with counterproposals addressing the identified concerns. The negotiation process that followed was meticulous and detail-oriented, each provision carefully structured to protect Thomas's interests while moving toward final resolution. Throughout this process, Claire maintained her two-track approach, formal cooperation through legal channels while periodically attempting indirect contact or influence. Each of these attempts was systematically documented and addressed, adding to the leverage Thomas maintained in negotiations. 3 months after the initial filing, a comprehensive settlement agreement was finalized. The terms reflected the reality that Claire's position had been comprehensively undermined by documented evidence of controlling behavior, financial manipulation, and infidelity. While the agreement avoided explicit language of fault or misconduct, the practical provisions clearly reflected the power dynamics that had been established through the legal process. The final document was signed in a conference room at Margaret's office, with Claire and her attorney present in person while Thomas participated via secure video connection, an arrangement that maintained the separation established by the protective orders while allowing necessary legal processes to conclude. On screen, Thomas observed Claire's carefully composed expression as she signed each page. The polished, controlled demeanor she presented in professional settings was firmly in place, betraying no emotion beyond appropriate solemnity for the occasion. Only someone who knew her intimately would recognize the tension around her eyes and the slightly too precise movements of her hand, subtle tells that the composed exterior masked significant underlying distress. When the signing was complete, Claire looked directly at the camera for the first time, clearly expecting some final exchange or acknowledgement. Thomas maintained neutral eye contact briefly, then nodded once to Margaret indicating the process was complete from his perspective. The connection was terminated without words being exchanged, the final interaction of their marriage conducted through proxies rather than direct communication. It's done, Margaret confirmed when they met in person later that day. The judge has reviewed and approved all provisions. The dissolution is final, the protective orders remain in place for the specified period, and all financial divisions will proceed according to the established timeline. Thomas absorbed this information with a complex mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, lingering sadness for what might have been under different circumstances, and most predominantly, a profound sense of reclaimed autonomy. What happens now? He asked, the question addressing the practical transition from legal proceedings to post-dissolution life. Now you begin the process of rebuilding on your own terms, Margaret replied. The legal framework we've established provides protection for that process, financial independence, physical separation, and clear boundaries regarding any future interactions. The rest is up to you. The following weeks involved practical transitions, securing a permanent residence to replace the temporary apartment, establishing new financial structures to replace the joint accounts that had been divided, and gradually reintegrating with social and professional circles that had been carefully managed during the legal proceedings. Throughout this period, Claire maintained the pattern established during later legal phases, no direct contact attempts but occasional indirect approaches through mutual connections, each presenting her as reasonably accepting the situation while subtly seeking information about Thomas's circumstances or potentially creating openings for direct communication. Each of these attempts was addressed according to established protocols, polite but firm redirection, documentation of the interaction, and maintenance of the boundaries established through legal processes. Over time, these approaches diminished in frequency, suggesting Claire was finally accepting the immutability of the situation. 6 months after the dissolution was finalized, Thomas met with Margaret for a final review of any outstanding matters. The practical aspects of their settlement had been implemented without significant complications: the marital home sold, proceeds distributed according to the agreement, personal property divided through structured processes, and financial entanglements systematically unwound. From a legal perspective, everything has been properly concluded, Margaret confirmed. The protective orders remain in place for another 6 months per the agreement, though you have the option to petition for extension if circumstances warrant. That won't be necessary, Thomas replied after brief consideration. The established boundaries seem to be functioning effectively at this point. As their meeting concluded, Margaret offered a final observation that extended beyond legal assessment to personal insight. When you first came to my office, you described a relationship where Claire had convinced you, and everyone around you, that you couldn't function independently. That your professional success, social connections, and even basic financial management depended on her superior capabilities. Thomas nodded, remembering that initial consultation where he had finally verbalized patterns that had developed so gradually he'd barely recognized their cumulative impact. What strikes me now, Margaret continued, is how comprehensively that narrative has been disproven. Throughout this process, you've demonstrated exceptional strategic thinking, emotional regulation, and methodical implementation, all qualities Claire insisted you lacked without her guidance. The observation resonated with Thomas's own evolving self-perception. The man who had meticulously planned and executed his exit from a controlling marriage bore little resemblance to the supposedly dependent, indecisive person Claire had described to their social circle. The contrast between her characterization and his demonstrated capabilities was perhaps the most significant outcome of the entire process. That disproven narrative may be the most important result of everything we've done, Thomas acknowledged. Not just legally establishing independence, but personally reclaiming self-perception that had been systematically undermined. As he left Margaret's office for the final time, Thomas reflected on the journey from that moment when Claire had laughed at his suggestion of separation, her absolute confidence that he couldn't leave because she controlled too many aspects of his life. The woman who had said he would never leave her had been proven catastrophically wrong, not through emotional confrontation where her manipulation skills would give her advantage, but through methodical preparation, strategic implementation, and the irrefutable voice of legal documentation. He had let his lawyer do the talking, and the carefully constructed evidence had spoken volumes that Claire could neither dismiss nor manipulate. 3 weeks later, Thomas accepted a promotion at his engineering firm, a senior leadership role that recognized his technical expertise and strategic capabilities. The position represented not just professional advancement but personal validation, confirmation that his capabilities extended far beyond the limited characterization Claire had consistently presented. The announcement generated significant professional attention, including a feature in an industry publication highlighting Thomas's innovative approaches to structural challenges in urban environments. The article, shared widely through professional networks, eventually reached Claire through her financial industry connections. Her response came through the only channel still permitted by their agreement, formal legal communication. Our client has noted recent professional developments regarding Mr. Bennett's career advancement. While dissolution agreements include non-disparagement provisions, they do not preclude expressions of appropriate acknowledgement for significant achievements. Accordingly, Mrs. Parker, formerly Bennett, wishes to convey congratulations regarding this professional milestone and acknowledgement of Mr. Bennett's technical capabilities that she has consistently recognized throughout their acquaintance. The communication represented Claire's continued attempt to rewrite history, positioning herself as having consistently recognized capabilities she had actually undermined and dismissed throughout their marriage. The strategic repositioning was transparent to Thomas, who recognized it as another attempt to establish a revised narrative that minimized her controlling behaviors. After consultation with Margaret, who maintained advisory capacity regarding communication protocols, Thomas authorized a brief, formal response. Mr. Bennett acknowledges receipt of communication. No response is required or forthcoming regarding personal matters. All professional acknowledgments should be directed through appropriate industry channels rather than personal legal representatives. The exchange represented the new reality Claire was finally being forced to accept. Thomas was no longer accessible through personal channels, no longer responsive to emotional manipulation tactics, and no longer defined by the limitations she had systematically imposed throughout their relationship. 1 year after the initial filing, Thomas completed his transition to entirely independent life structures, new residence established in his own carefully selected neighborhood, professional advancement secured through his demonstrated capabilities, social connections rebuilt based on authentic relationships rather than Claire's curated network, and financial independence established through systems he controlled directly. The man who had once been characterized as fundamentally dependent on his wife's superior management had systematically demonstrated the opposite reality, not through angry assertions or emotional defiance, but through methodical implementation of carefully constructed plans. The transformation wasn't merely practical but fundamental, reflecting reclaimed agency in every aspect of life that had previously been subject to Claire's control. During a rare social gathering that included people from their former shared circle, Thomas overheard a conversation between mutual acquaintances who didn't realize he was within earshot. "Have you heard anything about Claire recently?" one asked. "Only that she's relocated to the Boston office of her firm," the other replied. "Apparently she requested the transfer after everything settled. Fresh start, I suppose. Such a strange situation." She always described Tom as completely dependent on her management, practically helpless with practical matters. Yet he seems to be thriving while she's the one who needed to relocate. "I've been thinking about that too." Looking back, there were always inconsistencies in how she characterized him versus what we actually observed. His competence at work, his thoughtful planning for events, his attention to detail, none of it matched her descriptions of him needing constant guidance. The conversation confirmed what Thomas had suspected. Claire's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling not through dramatic confrontation but through simple observation of demonstrated reality. The people who had accepted her characterization were reassessing based on observable evidence rather than controlled narrative. That evening, as Thomas drove home to the residence he had selected and furnished according to his own preferences, he reflected on Claire's absolute certainty when she had dismissed his suggestion of separation a year earlier. "Leave me? Oh, Tom. You won't leave. You can't." The woman who had been so confident in her assessment had fundamentally misunderstood both the man she had married and the consequences of her own behavior. She had mistaken compliance for dependency, strategic patience for indecision, and temporary accommodation for permanent acceptance. Most significantly, she had failed to recognize that the methodical, detail-oriented approach that made Thomas an exceptional structural engineer could be applied to personal challenges as effectively as professional ones. The same precision that allowed him to identify weaknesses in physical structures had enabled him to recognize vulnerabilities in the control systems Claire had established, and to methodically address them without alerting her to his preparations. She had said he would never leave her, dismissing the very possibility with contemptuous certainty. He had proven her wrong not through emotional confrontation but through strategic implementation, letting his lawyer do the talking while his meticulously documented evidence spoke for itself. The final communication Thomas received regarding Claire came from an unexpected source, her sister Elaine, who sent a brief email to his professional account. "Thomas, I know we're not supposed to have direct contact per the legal agreements, but I felt compelled to reach out briefly. Claire is relocating to Boston permanently next month. Before she leaves, I wanted to acknowledge something that's been bothering me throughout this situation. I should have recognized the patterns in how Claire treated you. The subtle undermining, the constant repositioning of your contributions, the gradual isolation from independent connections, these were patterns I've observed in her relationships since childhood but failed to address directly. While I can't undo my complicity in enabling these dynamics, I can at least acknowledge them. What happened wasn't a mutual misunderstanding or simple incompatibility as Claire has framed it. It was a systematic pattern of control that you addressed in the only way that would likely be effective given her resistance to direct accountability. I don't expect or need a response. I simply wanted you to know that at least one person in her family recognizes the reality of what occurred rather than the carefully managed narrative she's created. Elaine. Thomas read the email several times, recognizing the significant step it represented for someone from Claire's immediate family to acknowledge the reality he had documented. After careful consideration, he composed a brief response. Elaine, I appreciate your message and the perspective it represents. While I've moved forward from this situation with Claire, recognition of objective reality rather than managed narrative is meaningful. I wish you well in your own path forward. Thomas. The exchange represented a final confirmation that the carefully constructed systems of control Claire had established weren't just legally dismantled but fundamentally exposed. The narrative she had maintained throughout their marriage, helpless Thomas completely dependent on capable Claire, had been comprehensively disproven through demonstrated evidence rather than emotional assertion. She had said he would never leave her. His lawyer, and his meticulously documented evidence, had proven otherwise. 2 years after the finalization of his divorce, Thomas found himself in an unexpected location, standing on a beachfront balcony in San Diego, watching the Pacific sunset with a glass of wine in hand. The consulting project that had brought him to California was scheduled to last 6 months, a significant professional opportunity that he had accepted without the hesitation or consultation that would have characterized similar decisions during his marriage. "Penny for your thoughts?" asked Diane Reeves, joining him at the railing. A fellow structural engineer he'd met through the consulting project, Diane had quickly become both professional colleague and personal friend during his time in San Diego. "Just appreciating the view," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the horizon where the sun was sinking into the ocean. "And reflecting on how different my life is now compared to 3 years ago." Diane nodded, familiar with the broad outlines of Thomas's history. He had shared elements of his experience during their growing friendship, not as a defining narrative but as context for certain perspectives and boundaries he maintained. "Anniversary of sorts?" she asked perceptively. "In a way," Thomas acknowledged. 3 years ago today was when I discovered Claire's latest infidelity, the catalyst that finally pushed me to implement the exit strategy I'd been developing. The strategy she never saw coming because she was so convinced of her control, Diane recalled from previous conversations. "Exactly. She was certain I couldn't function independently because she'd spent years convincing me, and everyone around us, of that narrative." Thomas took a sip of wine, the memory no longer carrying the emotional charge it once had. "The irony is that dismantling that narrative required exactly the capabilities she insisted I lacked: methodical planning, strategic implementation, emotional discipline." "Proving her wrong by demonstrating precisely what she claimed you couldn't do," Diane observed. "That's rather poetic justice." Thomas smiled slightly, appreciating her perception. "I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes. There was a certain symmetry to it." Their conversation shifted to other topics: the consulting project's progress, upcoming presentations to the client, plans for the weekend. The easy flow of their interaction represented another aspect of Thomas's reclaimed life: relationships based on mutual respect and authentic connection rather than manipulation and control. Later that evening, as Thomas reviewed emails in his temporary apartment, a message from Margaret Sullivan appeared in his inbox, an unexpected connection to the past that had gradually receded from daily consideration. "Thomas, I hope this finds you well. While our formal professional relationship concluded some time ago, I wanted to inform you of a situation that might be relevant to your interests given our previous work together. Claire Parker, formerly Bennett, has apparently returned to the area and has made inquiries through professional channels regarding your current status. No direct contact has been attempted, but her interest suggests potential reconnection efforts may be forthcoming. While all legal protections established through our proceedings have technically expired, the documentation and protocols we established remain valuable resources should any unwelcome contact occur. Please feel free to contact my office if circumstances warrant renewed professional assistance. Regards, Margaret Sullivan." The message triggered a complex reaction, not anxiety or distress as might have occurred closer to the divorce, but a measured awareness that required acknowledgement. Thomas had moved forward substantially in the intervening years, establishing new patterns of life that bore little resemblance to his existence during marriage. Yet the notification that Claire had returned and was making inquiries represented a potential disruption to that carefully constructed independence. After careful consideration, Thomas replied, "Margaret. Thank you for the courtesy notification. I'm currently on extended assignment in California, which provides both geographic and professional separation from potential local contact attempts. However, I appreciate the reminder that established documentation and protocols remain available if needed. I hope your practice continues to thrive. Your assistance during a critical life transition remains deeply appreciated. Thomas." The exchange complete, Thomas returned to his project work, deliberately choosing not to allow Claire's potential reappearance to dominate his attention or disrupt his current path. The measured response represented another aspect of his personal evolution, acknowledging potential challenges without granting them disproportionate importance. 3 weeks later, the anticipated contact attempt materialized in the form of an email to Thomas's professional account. "Thomas. I hope this message finds you well. After considerable reflection and personal growth work, I'm reaching out with the simple goal of acknowledging past mistakes and expressing genuine regret for my role in the breakdown of our relationship. This isn't an attempt to re-establish personal connection or revisit painful history, merely a step in my own accountability process. The years since our separation have provided perspective that wasn't available to me during that difficult period. If this communication is unwelcome, I completely understand. No response is necessary or expected. Wishing you continued success, Claire." Thomas studied the message carefully, recognizing the calculated approach it represented. The language was measured and appropriate, avoiding specific acknowledgement of documented behaviors while presenting a general sense of accountability that could mean anything from genuine remorse to strategic repositioning. The mention of personal growth work suggested therapy or similar development without concrete details about what behaviors were being addressed or what changes had actually occurred. Most tellingly, the message positioned itself as requiring no response, a preemptive deflection of potential rejection that simultaneously created subtle pressure to engage. The casual mention of wishing continued success implied knowledge of Thomas's current professional situation without explaining how such information had been obtained. After careful consideration, Thomas decided against any response. The message didn't require or justify engagement, it contained no practical matters requiring address, no specific accountability for documented behaviors, and no authentic acknowledgement of the manipulation patterns that had characterized their relationship. Engaging would simply create an opening for continued communication without clear purpose or benefit. Instead, Thomas forwarded the message to Margaret with a brief note. "For documentation purposes only. No response provided or intended. Currently maintaining complete professional focus on California project with no plans to engage with past relationship dynamics." Margaret's acknowledgement came promptly. "Documented. Approach seems appropriate given content and context. Will maintain in records should pattern development occur." Having addressed the practical aspects of the situation, Thomas deliberately redirected his attention to current priorities, the consulting project, his developing friendship with Diane and other San Diego colleagues, and the potential professional opportunities emerging from his West Coast connections. 2 days later, a more direct approach materialized, a LinkedIn connection request from Claire accompanied by a professionally worded note referencing potential industry collaboration opportunities. The strategic approach was evident, using professional networking as justification for establishing digital connection that could potentially expand to other channels. Thomas declined the request without comment, maintaining the clear boundaries he had established. The professional justification was transparently tactical rather than genuine, their respective fields had minimal practical overlap, and any legitimate industry collaboration could be arranged through appropriate organizational channels rather than personal connections. The third attempt came through mutual professional acquaintances, a carefully orchestrated coincidental mention of Claire during a video conference with Thomas's home office team. Martin Reynolds, a colleague who had known them both, casually referenced seeing Claire at an industry event and mentioned she had spoken highly of Thomas's structural innovation approaches. Thomas acknowledged the comment with professional courtesy but no personal engagement, steering the conversation back to project specifics without creating opening for further discussion of his former wife. The deliberate redirection established clear professional boundaries without requiring explicit rejection of the indirect contact attempt. These patterns continued over subsequent weeks, periodic, strategically calculated approaches through various channels, each carefully designed to appear coincidental or professionally justified rather than deliberate personal contact attempts. Thomas addressed each systematically, maintaining documentation while refusing engagement that would create openings for renewed influence attempts. "She's quite persistent," Diane observed one evening after witnessing Thomas politely deflect another indirect approach during a client call where Claire's name had been strategically mentioned by someone in her professional network. 3 months of systematic contact attempts through various channels suggests this isn't casual interest. "It's consistent with established patterns," Thomas replied, having shared the situation with Diane as context for the awkward professional moments she had observed. "During our marriage, Claire interpreted any response, even negative engagement, as successful contact that could potentially be leveraged into influence. Complete disengagement was the only boundary she ultimately respected. And yet she continues attempting contact," Diane noted. "That seems contradictory." "It's actually consistent with her longer-term approach," Thomas explained. "When immediate tactics fail, she typically shifts to persistence over time, the assumption that continuous attempts through multiple channels will eventually create an opening, particularly if circumstances or emotions shift. A war of attrition rather than direct conquest," Diane observed with professional analytical detachment. "Exactly. The strategy assumes the other person will eventually engage out of exhaustion, curiosity, politeness, or shifting emotional states." Thomas's tone remained measured rather than resentful, clinical assessment rather than emotional reaction. "It was quite effective during our marriage because I hadn't recognized the pattern or established systematic boundaries." The conversation shifted to their upcoming presentation for the client's executive team, both professionals refocusing on immediate priorities rather than allowing past relationship dynamics to dominate current attention. This deliberate redirection represented another aspect of Thomas's reclaimed agency, the ability to acknowledge potential disruptions without granting them disproportionate influence over present focus. When the California project concluded 3 months later, Thomas faced a significant decision: return to his established position at the home office or accept the West Coast Division's offer of a permanent leadership role in their expanding structural engineering department. The opportunity represented both professional advancement and geographic distance from the persistent contact attempts Claire had maintained despite consistent non-engagement. After careful consideration that included both professional and personal factors, Thomas accepted the California position. The decision wasn't primarily motivated by creating distance from Claire's contact attempts; those had been effectively managed through established boundaries, but the geographic separation was a contributing factor in a complex decision matrix that prioritized professional development and quality of life considerations. The transition to permanent California residence proceeded methodically, property considerations addressed through professional management of his East Coast condominium, logistical details handled with characteristic attention to detail, professional relationships adjusted to new reporting structures. Throughout this process, Thomas maintained the systematic approach to life management that had emerged following his divorce: organized, strategic, and independent. 6 months into his permanent California position, an unexpected development emerged through professional channels. Claire had accepted a position with a financial services firm that maintained significant client relationships with Thomas's engineering company. The arrangement created potential professional intersection points despite the geographic separation he had established. "This seems surprisingly coincidental," noted Richard Harmon, Thomas's California supervisor, when informing him of the new client relationship. "Given your history, we can establish appropriate protocols to ensure you don't have direct interaction if that's your preference." "I appreciate the consideration," Thomas replied. "While I don't anticipate any issues maintaining professional boundaries, having established protocols would be prudent given the circumstances." The resulting arrangement specified that Thomas would not be assigned to projects directly involving Claire's financial team, communication would be channeled through appropriate department representatives rather than direct contact, and any industry events involving both companies would be staffed with awareness of potential interaction concerns. These protocols functioned effectively for several months, allowing professional relationships to proceed appropriately while maintaining personal boundaries. Then came an unexpected direct communication attempt, an email from Claire to Thomas's personal account rather than his professional address. Thomas, I hope this message finds you well in your new California role. While I've respected your clear preference for distance over the past year, circumstances have created a situation where direct communication seems appropriate. As you may be aware, my current position with Westridge Financial involves significant interaction with your company's East Coast division. While we've maintained appropriate professional separation, there's an upcoming situation that potentially affects you directly. Westridge is co-sponsoring the International Structural Engineering Conference in San Diego next month. As lead financial representative, I'll be attending alongside several members of your executive team. Given your leadership position in the California division, your participation seems likely. Rather than risk uncomfortable surprise encounters, I thought direct acknowledgement of this potential interaction might allow appropriate preparation. I remain committed to maintaining whatever boundaries you consider necessary while ensuring professional obligations are fulfilled respectfully. If you prefer to address this through intermediaries, I completely understand and will respect that preference. Regards, Claire. The message represented a strategic approach Thomas recognized immediately, using legitimate professional circumstances to justify direct personal contact while positioning herself as considerate and boundary-respecting. The conference reference created plausible justification while establishing foreknowledge of Thomas's likely professional activities and location. After careful consideration and consultation with both his supervisor and legal counsel, Thomas provided a brief, professionally appropriate response. Claire. Thank you for the professional courtesy notification. I'll be coordinating with my department regarding conference participation and appropriate protocols for vendor interactions. All professional communication should continue through established channels per existing company policies. Regards, Thomas. The response maintained appropriate professional courtesy while establishing clear boundaries regarding communication channels. By referencing company policies, Thomas effectively removed personal preference from the equation, positioning the boundaries as organizational protocols rather than individual choice. As the conference approached, Thomas worked with his company's professional development team to establish appropriate scheduling. He would participate in technical presentations and key networking events while avoiding specific vendor-sponsored functions where direct interaction with Claire would be most likely. The arrangement balanced professional responsibilities with personal boundaries, allowing appropriate industry participation without unnecessary intersection points. During the conference itself, Thomas maintained this balanced approach, fully engaged in relevant professional activities while strategically avoiding unnecessary interaction opportunities. When circumstances eventually created an unavoidable intersection point during a major presentation session, Thomas acknowledged Claire's presence with professional courtesy, a brief nod of recognition without further engagement, then focused on the technical content being presented. The measured interaction demonstrated how completely Thomas had reclaimed his personal agency since their divorce. Where Claire had once controlled multiple aspects of his professional and social interactions, he now navigated potential contact situations with calm independence, maintaining appropriate boundaries without emotional reactivity or disruption to professional responsibilities. Following the conference, Thomas received feedback from colleagues who had observed the situation without knowing its full context. I was impressed with how smoothly you handled the vendor interactions, noted Diane, who had participated in several key sessions. Particularly with the financial team that seemed especially interested in engaging our division. Professional boundaries are important in maintaining appropriate client relationships, Thomas replied simply, neither elaborating on personal history nor pretending the situation required no management. 2 weeks after the conference, Thomas received a formal communication through legal channels, the first such contact since the divorce proceedings had concluded years earlier. Our client, Claire Parker, has authorized us to convey the following communication regarding recent professional interactions and future professional boundaries. The recent conference interactions confirmed my understanding that our personal history necessitates continued professional distance despite potential business intersections. I have accordingly requested reassignment from any projects directly involving West Coast divisions of your firm, effective immediately. This decision reflects recognition that maintaining appropriate separation serves both our professional interests. No response is necessary or expected. All future professional matters involving Westridge Financial will be handled through appropriate departmental representatives with no direct involvement from our client in matters potentially intersecting with your responsibilities. The formal communication represented a significant shift from previous approaches, explicit acknowledgement that continued contact attempts were ineffective, acceptance of professional separation as appropriate boundary, and commitment to structural adjustments rather than continued persistence. The change suggested Claire had finally recognized the immutability of Thomas's boundaries after consistent non-engagement with multiple contact strategies over an extended period. This development created space for Thomas to reflect on the complete arc of his experience, from controlled spouse believing himself incapable of independent function, to methodically preparing his strategic exit, to establishing and maintaining boundaries despite persistent testing, to finally receiving acknowledgement that those boundaries were both appropriate and permanent. The woman who had laughed at his suggestion of leaving, who had confidently stated he couldn't, leave her, had finally recognized the comprehensive failure of her assessment. The man she had characterized as fundamentally dependent had systematically demonstrated complete independence through methodical planning, strategic implementation, and consistent boundary maintenance over years rather than merely months. Most significantly, Thomas recognized how completely his self-perception had transformed through this process. The person Claire had characterized, indecisive, incapable of independent management, fundamentally dependent on her superior capabilities, bore no resemblance to the man who had engineered his exit, established his independence, advanced his career, and maintained clear boundaries throughout persistent testing. That evening, as Thomas walked along the San Diego shoreline with Diane, she offered an observation that captured this transformation perfectly. "You know what's remarkable about your experience? Not just that you left a controlling relationship, though that's certainly significant. It's that you did it in a way that systematically disproved the fundamental narrative that enabled the control in the first place." Thomas considered this perspective thoughtfully. "That wasn't necessarily my conscious intention. I was focused on creating effective exit rather than proving specific points." "Which makes it even more powerful," Diane noted. "You weren't trying to demonstrate anything, you were simply functioning according to capabilities you actually possessed despite being told repeatedly that you lacked them." The disproven narrative was a natural consequence rather than a deliberate goal. The assessment resonated with Thomas's own evolving understanding of his experience. The most profound outcome wasn't merely establishing independence from Claire's control but reclaiming self-perception that had been systematically undermined throughout their relationship. As they continued walking, Diane asked a question that had emerged periodically throughout their growing friendship. "Do you think you'll ever fully trust in a relationship again? After experiencing such comprehensive manipulation from someone who presented herself as supportive?" Thomas considered the question carefully, appreciating both its significance and Diane's directness in asking it. "I think trust has different dimensions now," he replied thoughtfully. "It's not an all-or-nothing proposition based on emotional connection or presented intentions. It's an evolving assessment based on consistent alignment between statements and actions over time." "Trust is verified pattern rather than assumed state," Diane observed. "Exactly. And most importantly, trust in my own perceptions and boundaries regardless of external narratives." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's perhaps the most significant change. I no longer question my own reality when it conflicts with someone else's characterization." The conversation continued as they walked along the shore, discussing perspectives on relationships, professional developments, and potential weekend hiking plans with the easy comfort of authentic connection. This friendship, with its mutual respect, clear communication, and absence of manipulation, represented another aspect of Thomas's reclaimed life, the ability to form genuine connections based on shared values rather than controlled narratives. 3 years to the day after his divorce was finalized, Thomas received a small package at his office, a delivery that contained a single item and brief note. Thomas. During recent estate management following my mother's passing, this item was discovered among her possessions. Given its personal nature, appropriate return seemed warranted despite our history. No response necessary or expected. Claire. The package contained Thomas's grandfather's watch, a family heirloom he had believed permanently lost during the divorce process. The timepiece held significant sentimental value, having been passed from his grandfather to his father to him, representing a family connection Claire had often dismissed as pointless sentimentality about an outdated object. The return of this specific item, with its associated history, carried symbolic weight beyond the physical object itself. Throughout their marriage, Claire had consistently minimized Thomas's family connections and personal history, positioning her family and perspectives as inherently superior. The watch represented a tangible connection to heritage she had systematically devalued, its return acknowledging both its significance and her previous failure to recognize that value. After careful consideration, Thomas sent a brief, formal acknowledgement through appropriate legal channels. Receipt of family heirloom acknowledged. Return appreciated. The minimal response maintained appropriate boundaries while acknowledging the gesture's significance, professional courtesy without opening channels for renewed personal engagement. Later that evening, as Thomas secured the watch in his home safe, he reflected on the complete journey from controlled spouse to independent individual. The transformation hadn't occurred in a single dramatic moment but through methodical implementation of strategic planning, each step building on previous progress toward comprehensive reclamation of personal agency. Most significantly, the process had not required Claire's understanding or acknowledgement to succeed. While she had eventually recognized the reality of his independence through consistent demonstration, that recognition was incidental to rather than necessary for his reclaimed agency. The success of his approach had never depended on her perception but on his systematic implementation of carefully constructed plans. She had said he would never leave her, laughing at the very suggestion, confident in her assessment that he couldn't function independently of her management. He had proven her catastrophically wrong not through emotional confrontation but through methodical preparation, strategic implementation, and the irrefutable voice of legal documentation. He had let his lawyer do the talking, and the carefully constructed evidence had spoken volumes that Claire could neither dismiss nor manipulate. 5 years after discovering Claire's latest infidelity, the catalyst that had finally prompted implementation of his exit strategy, Thomas stood on the balcony of his San Diego home, watching the Pacific sunset with characteristic thoughtful attention. The property represented another aspect of his reclaimed agency, selected according to his preferences, purchased through his independent financial resources, designed to reflect his personal aesthetic rather than someone else's approved vision. As Diane joined him on the balcony, her presence comfortable and familiar after 2 years of deepening relationship, Thomas reflected on the complete arc from controlled spouse to independent partner. The relationship they had built bore no resemblance to his marriage with Claire, mutual respect rather than manipulation, authentic communication rather than strategic positioning, genuine support rather than systematic undermining. Anniversary reflections again? Diane asked perceptively, noting his contemplative expression. Different anniversary this time, Thomas replied. 5 years since implementation rather than discovery. The point where strategic planning became decisive action. Diane nodded understanding, familiar with the significance of these milestone moments in Thomas's personal history. The transition from preparation to execution. From theoretical to practical. Exactly. The point where possibility became reality through implementation rather than merely consideration. Thomas smiled slightly, the expression reflecting genuine ease rather than practiced performance. 5 years ago today, I proved Claire wrong not by arguing but by acting, letting my lawyer do the talking while methodically documented evidence spoke for itself. As they stood together watching the sunset, Thomas recognized the most profound aspect of his transformation. The man who had once believed himself incapable of independent function now navigated life with confident agency, making decisions based on authentic assessment rather than external direction, forming relationships grounded in mutual respect rather than controlled dynamics, and moving forward on his own terms rather than someone else's carefully managed narrative. She had said he would never leave her. His lawyer, and his methodically documented evidence, had proven otherwise.